Hi, I'm Torsten. This is a review of The Many Deaths of Laila Starr by Ram V and my interpretation of it. It will contain spoilers for the book, just to let you know now. The Many Deaths of Laila Starr is written by Ram V and illustrated by Filipe Andrade. Ram V was born in India. He later lived in the United States, but now calls London his home. Filipe Andrade is a Portuguese artist from Lisbon who did sculpturing before drawing comics. He's done work for Marvel before working on this title. Filipe's art perfectly matches Ram's storytelling. It reminds me a bit of Gabriel Bá, and there are some similarities to books like Day Tripper that go beyond just the art. The Many Deaths of Laila Starr has a simple premise. Death gets fired from her job and takes over the body of deceased Laila Starr to live a mortal life on Earth. The reason for her getting fired is that a child was born who shall bring eternal life. That child is Darius. So Death sets out to eliminate the reason for her unemployment, meaning she's trying to kill Darius, hoping to get her job back. And that's where things get interesting. Because from here, the plot and the story go different ways, for the most part at least. We follow Death in Laila Starr's body and how she meets and interacts with Darius at various stages of his life. The plot jumps in irregular intervals, not always showing us what's causing the characters to act the way they act. That part is revealed in a more subtle way between issues and mostly through Darius. Laila meets Darius every time someone in Darius' life has died or is dying. Throughout each issue, we see Death is evolving and having human emotions. In issue 1, she tries to kill a baby without remorse and learns it's not the same. In issue 2, Death learns about human death rituals and starts having more intense human emotions. By the time we meet her in issue 3, Death is handing out life advice to Darius. She thinks she has answers to what life is about. In issue 4, she starts having remorse. She feels guilt and develops empathy. I think it died because it couldn't go on without its friend. When we meet her again in issue 5, both her and Darius come to realize the worth of a well-lived life. And both meet each other emotionally at the end of his life. Laila actually asked Darius to use his invention of immortality on himself. Of course, he declines, as eternal life wouldn't be of any consequence. Overall, we see Death's emotional growth as she experiences life in Laila Starr's body. She also learns the value of life through her conversations with Darius, and in the end doesn't even care much to have her job back. But apart from that, her foretold fate isn't coming to fruition. She's sent to Earth to live a mortal life. In issue 1, she predicts, "I'm going to grow old and have aches and pains." But that doesn't happen. Laila doesn't age. And when she dies, and she dies a lot, she's brought back to live on Earth again. Every single time. That's not how mortals live. And that's something that doesn't change throughout the book. Each of her deaths actually becomes more meaningless, which is shown through the respective commentary. Her death in issue 1 was all over the newspapers for a while. The girl who died and lived and died again. In issue 3, the fire department stated that there was only one casualty claimed by the fire. And in issue 4, Laila comments on her own death. The article doesn't even mention me, as a flood destroyed the Chinese temple with her inside it. But Death getting fired is also of no consequence for humanity. People still die, even of natural causes. Why, in issue 4, for example? Death losing her job does not change humanity's fate, nor does it make her life a mortal life. She's mainly a witness to Darius's life. This, interestingly enough, makes her more human as she develops human emotions and learns the meaning of life. Her and Darius learn and progress emotionally together. While Darius is figuring out death, death is figuring out life. So who is this Darius I've been talking about? Darius has his own story in this book, or better, how Darius manages the experience of death is its own story. We meet him through Laila as we move along the plot, which only happens at crucial times of Darius' life. In issue 1, at his birth. In issue 2, when Bradhan dies, a servant of Darius' childhood, which is Darius' first experience with death at the age of 8. In issue 3, when 20-year-old Darius' best friend Zafar gets killed by an angry mob. And in issue 4, Darius' wife dies when he's only 36. And finally, Darius' own death at the age of 64 in issue 5. Laila, progressing through the plot, is used to tell the story of Darius' experience with death, and therefore anyone's experience with death during the course of one's lifetime. Darius represents how we, or at least most of us, feel about dying. Laila appears in Darius' life every time he's contemplating death. This is Darius having a conversation with death. And that's where the cultural backdrop of this book becomes very important. Ramvi introduces us to Indian culture, places, the Hindu pantheon, references to other authors, and more. The story is set in various locations across India, but mostly in Mumbai. Darius was born in Mumbai in 2019. In issue 2, we visit the outskirts of Mumbai, where his family has moved. We see an abandoned pillow factory in issue 3, a factory that was booming in the 1980s, but now, the year is 2039, 60 years later, had become Darius' hangout place and is later the target of an attack by political activists. We meet the last Chinese temple in Mumbai in issue 4, and issue 5 takes us south to Gao, or more precisely, 6 miles from Palolem, a beach at the Indian west coast just south of Goa, which is like Mumbai, located at the Indian west coast. Throughout the book, we meet members of the Hindu pantheon, the goddess of death. While not directly mentioned by name, my guess is that death is meant to represent the Hindu goddess Kali. Kali is the goddess of death, among other things. Her physical manifestation also matches that of death in this book. But there are between 21 and 51 avatars of Kali alone. So Laila Starr is just another avatar of Kali? Ramvi actually gives us one additional hint in issue 4. The newspaper reads, "Storm Kali causes devastation." We further meet Brahma, a Hindu god who still has to explain himself to corporate for some reason. Brahma has a servant called Agni. And then there's Prana, the god of life, who is narrating most of the book, who is probably the only one on the pantheon who really cares about death. In issue 3, he says to her, "I'm nothing without you," which is something she herself realizes in the end as well. We briefly meet the goddess of taxes, who occupies the corner office for some reason. Then in issue 5, the shoebox is labeled Vata. Vata is another name for Vayu, the Hindu god of air, wind, and breath. Vayu is also known as Prana, the life force. But we have met Prana already, even though spelled differently, but he's narrating the book. Could this mean that Prana, god of life, helped Darius to invent immortality? Would he have done so to help Kali appreciate mortal life? And while not a member of the pantheon itself, we meet Ka, the funeral crow. According to ancient Hindu beliefs, crows are the linkage between the dead and the living. They are even honored by rituals during the days of Shraddh. We also meet a Chinese temple that's become abandoned. The temple tells us that it has forgotten Mandarin, but his Hindi and Marathi are still great. It's the last Chinese temple left in Mumbai. It says, "It's just been so long since I've had any visitors." This could represent the decline of Buddhism in India. I tried to find information supporting this, but found that at least for the past 70 years, a rather stable 0.7% of the Indian population practices Buddhism. The reference is either a bit more nuanced, or we have to zoom out and look at the larger time frame. Or is it that Ram V predicts the decline of Buddhism? Given that this issue is set in the future, the year is 2055 to be precise. I have a feeling there are many more references in this book for people who know more about Indian and Hindu culture. I myself know very little, and it was difficult to find information for what I assumed to be references. The Chinese temple was kind of in your face, something you can't miss even on your first read-through. Looking at each of the 5 single issues separately, they tell their own story. That in the end becomes something bigger. Issue 1 is about anger and revenge. Death is angry about getting fired and goes out to seek revenge on a baby. Issue 2 is about friendship, and that friendship can persevere despite differences in age and caste hierarchy. Issue 3 tells a classic coming-of-age story with a love triangle between Darius, Safar, and Danica. Issue 4 is about loss and empathy. The Chinese temple loses Wai, Mumbai loses its last Chinese temple, Darius loses more than just his wife. He starts abandoning his son, and Laila starts feeling guilty. Issue 5 shows life and death being in harmony. Death now values life for what it is and sees what life knew all along. Life without death is meaningless, and death without life is wasted. But before jumping ahead too much, let's shift the focus back to Darius and his interactions with Kali, the goddess of death, in Laila Starr's body. With her being a Hindu goddess, it means that every time Darius talks to Laila, he's having a conversation with God, the god of death, yet still a god. And as Darius keeps meeting Laila throughout his life, his feelings towards death itself change. His first conversation with death happens in issue 2. At the age of 8, he's in denial when Bradhan dies. Darius goes to see the funeral for himself. He meets Laila and tells her that Bradhan was like a god to him, who he thought of as incapable of dying. In issue 3, Darius is somewhat rejecting advice from Laila. He also seems to struggle with the idea of his best friend dying while having unresolved issues with him. The last time they saw each other, they had a huge fight. Darius asks Laila, "I can't have him back, can I?" And when Laila gives him life advice, his response is, "Who made you the expert on life?" and flips the cigarette away, setting the building on fire. In issue 4, Darius is angry. Having identified Laila for what she is, he is feeling being treated unfairly. He's yelling at her and physically attacks her. He then becomes depressed and abandons his responsibilities towards his son. We learn in issue 5 that Darius was dealing with his own grief when instead his son needed him the most. The relationship with his son never recovered. When we reach the end of the book, Darius has accepted death for what it is. The years have made him wise, if you will. We learn that he actually invented immortality 15 years prior, but decided not to use it. He even apologizes to Laila for being unkind when they last met. In summary, we see how Darius progresses through the 5 stages of grief, with the stages of anger and bargaining being flipped around. Something that definitely fits those situations better. Attacking Laila at the party in issue 3 wouldn't have made much sense. So it goes denial, bargaining, anger, those 2 are flipped, depression, and acceptance. Through those emotions, he's learning the meaning of life. It is as Laila told him in issue 3. The point of life, my friend, is to be smoked. We witness Darius's growth. He is able to make up with his son before he's dying, which for Darius brings closure to his biggest regret in life. This is so beautifully summarized in this one panel in issue 5. We all live those flawed, imperfect lives. Before I go, all I want is to see Neil and tell him I wish I could have done better. Darius has accepted death and is looking for closure with his son. Looking closer at Darius's and Laila's interactions, one could even say Laila is just a construct of Darius's mind. As I said before, Laila's power and purpose can easily be questioned. She doesn't age and is brought back to life every time she dies. In issue 3, the cigarette claims to have gained untold power after being kissed by death / Laila, but she was supposed to be a mere mortal. How come she's all that powerful? In addition to that, Laila's able to communicate with a ghost, a crow, and a building. No mortal is able to do that in this book or otherwise. And even more obvious is the image of Laila with 6 arms when she sits in Darius' apartment in issue 4. Maybe that's a hint Filipe Andrade is throwing us. Laila's emotional journey is that of Darius'. He himself goes through the journey that is life, making his own experiences with death. And if Laila was really all that powerful and real, why can't she help Darius in the end? He's dying and there's nothing I can do to stop it, she says. The reason Laila stayed with Darius at the end of his life was because death was always on Darius' mind during the final days of his life. Laila is Darius' interpretation of death, his own avatar of Kali, if you will. Darius really started living the moment he stopped worrying about death. That's why those moments happen in between issues and aren't part of the plot. Again, plot and story are somewhat separated here. We meet Darius only when he's concerned with death, which makes sense because the story is told from Laila's perspective. If the story was about death, why does Prana's narration of the final issue start with, "If we must speak of the end"? Laila isn't the one aging or dying. It's Darius' story. The first issue begins with Darius' birth. The first panel says, "It began on a Wednesday afternoon as Darius' mother rushed to the hospital to give birth." The final panel of the final issue shows Darius having died. This book is about Darius, his conversation with death. For those conversations to happen, death had to leave the Pantheon and descend to Earth. Premise leads to plot, which disguises the story. Ram V intertwines story and plot in a way that will reveal itself to you only if you pay close enough attention. It is full of hidden messages and meanings. Let's talk about hidden messages. Yes, I'm talking about the poems in issue 5. The pocketbook of poems Laila buys at Dabolim Airport in Panjim is written by Akur Puri, which is an anagram for Rupi Kaur, who is an Indian author. She published multiple poem collections written in the same style, using only lowercase letters. I couldn't find any of the actual poems from this book in any of Rupi's work. So I have to assume that she only functioned as an inspiration for Ram V to write his own poems, rather than him using actual source material, which makes sense that he's using an anagram of her name and not her actual name. But I could be wrong and hope I'm able to ask him one day. The first poem hits me directly as I try to unravel the secrets of this book. Sometimes I speak with words I hope you hear, and yet you extol all my unspoken mysteries. Sometimes I wonder. Does Ram V talk to me directly? Does he tell me not to go looking for a deeper meaning of this book? Am I overanalyzing? Maybe. When Darius and Laila are contemplating life, a second poem is injected. I won't repeat it here, but it clearly tries to answer the question for closure. To give life meaning. The answer, in short, is that life has to be lived. There is no end if you want to feel alive. When asking for what comes next, what lies beyond the edge of the sea, the answer is more of what came before. The third poem is the desire to have a worthy life to show for. Worthy as in filled with experiences, good and bad. Mistakes belong to life just as victories do. For making mistakes is not to fail in life. In the end, understanding those references add to your experience, but not knowing them does not take away this book's message. Life has to be experienced or smoked, to use their terminology. And Darius' confession in issue 5, we all live these flawed, imperfect lives, All we can do is to try our best. And to hope that we all will be as content with death as Darius is when we actually get there. To paraphrase the final panel, the miracle is to simply have lived. One question this book has for you is, if you had the key to immortality, would you use it? Thank you so much for listening to my interpretation of The Many Deaths of Laila Starr. Those were my thoughts. I formed some of them after talking about this book as part of the Near Mint Condition Patreon book club. So a big shout out to everyone there for getting together to talk about this book. It definitely inspired me to get my thoughts in order and make this video. Let me know if you come to the same conclusion, disagree, or want to add anything to the discussion in the comments below. Until next time, this was Torsten with a review of The Many Deaths of Laila Starr by Ram V and Filipe Andrade.